Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom Aleichem, welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, which is Shabbos Daf Kuf Chav Dalad. We're at the Mishnah on Amud Aleph, 15 lines from the top. Before we resume our discussion regarding the sugya of muktzah, which is very deep and all-encompassing, perhaps it would be great just as a small introduction to go through the words of the Rishonim and discuss the background, the basis for the Isser of being metaltal muktzah. So we have the Ravid who tells us that it's based on the Gemara of Total Atu Hoitzah, that we're concerned that a person gets over-involved in moving around objects. Perhaps he's going to do the Melacha Hoitzah, carry out things into Shesarabim. The Rambam says there's a concern that he might be engaged in Melachos. If he moves items, he might do Melachos with them. This appears to be specifically directed at those kelim which are used for Melachos, for instance, a hammer. The Rambam also says that one's overall conduct on Shabbos is meant to be different than during the weekday. We learned earlier regarding Shabbos clothing, Shabbos food. Likewise, says the Rambam, regarding moving around objects, one's not meant to simply transport things, move things around. One's meant to be restricted and limited in his interaction with objects. Therefore, the Rambam concludes that one could only move kelim hatzorech lei, utensils, kelim that he needs. Obviously, this is in addition to food and drink. But when it comes to objects, kelim, that's one condition, it has to be a kli, and tzorech lei, he needs it. It's performing a function. It's filling a need. Now, we have different categories of muktzah. So if these two things are requirements, it needs to be keli. So that rules out those things which are not considered to be utensils, random objects, pebbles, stones, pieces of wood, broken kelim. Those are off limits completely. We have things that we discussed earlier, things which are fragile, which are delicate. Those are called muktzah machmas chisara and kiss, on account of the loss which one incurs by mishandling these things. They're designated for their malachis, not meant to be used for anything else. Those things can't be moved under any circumstances. Then we have things which are malachte le'isser, which are designated to be used for malachis. A hammer, for instance, we know it in the Mishnah, one can use it to crack nuts. So the klisha malachte le'isser is another category, and then we have klisha malachte le'heter, of course, something which is designated for permissible use. Different categories, different halachas. Now, the loosely used term called muktzah, which is very widely applied, used in the world, is actually, there are many applications of muktzah, as we see different categories. So that term muktzah is loosely used and applied in all circumstances. But as we see, there are different categories, there are different levels of muktzah. There are some things which are off limits completely, like the stone, the pebbles. Then we have the tools which are malachti l'issa, which can be, we call it muktzah, but really it can't be used if it's l'tzorech, if he needs it to crack the nut. So it's muktzah, but it's a different level of muktzah. But again, the point here is that the heter is to use it. Kelim hatzorech lei. He's not merely meant to transport things. So if he doesn't need it, he's merely transporting it. That's not called tzorech lei. That's merely transporting. So that's the point. That's the formula that we need to apply to the upcoming sugya. Hopefully we'll have some clarity based on these words of the Rishonim. Begins the Mishnah. Kol ha-kelim nitalim, all kelim can be moved. We're speaking about something which is designated for permissible use. Malachte leheter. It can be moved l'tzorech, if it's for tzorech, filling a need. Shlo l'tzorech, even if it's not filling a need. They can only be moved l'tzorech, if he needs them. Rabbi Nechemia holds that a kli can only be moved l'tzorech tashmish hamyuchalei, for its defined purpose. The Gemara is going to elaborate on the opinions of a Tanna Kama and Rabbi Nechemia. Before we begin the Gemara, the term l'tzorech needs a little elaboration. What does it mean for a need, to fill a need, a purpose, for the function? What does that mean? So we have three levels actually of benefit from moving an item. We have a direct benefit, a direct hana, which is called tzorech gufay. He's going to use the kli itself. Take that hammer and crack the nuts. That's a direct hana. We have tzorech mekaymai. He needs the space underneath this muktzah item. He needs to vacate the area. It's a hana. He's benefiting from it. It's some sort of use, but it's an indirect hana. It's an indirect shimush. He's not actually using the kli itself. He's moving it so he should have the space available. That's indirect. That's level number 2. Level number 3 is he's benefiting, but very indirectly. He's moving the kli simply to preserve it, to protect it. He's taking it mechamal itself, from sun to shade. So there's no hana coming from the kli to him. He's benefiting because he's preserving his kli. He's sparing himself the loss. That's a different type of tiltal. So these are 3 different variations of tzorech, and the Gemara will discuss all 3 of them. Says the Gemara, my litzorich. What does the Tana Kama mean when he says he can move the kli litzorich to fill a need? My shaloi litzorich. What does he mean when he says shaloi litzorich? Amar Rabba. Litzorich means davar shemalachti leheter. We're speaking about something which is primarily used for heter use. So you can move it litzorich gufay. Litzorich means for the sake of the guf itself. He wants to use the kli itself directly. Shaloi litzorich is referring to davar shemalachti leheter. Litzorich mekaymai. You can move this same thing, this davar shemalachti leheter. Litzorich mekaymai, even if he's not directly benefiting from the kli. He's merely moving it out to vacate the space, to vacate the area. That is also allowed, but we're speaking about a kli shemalachti leheter. So going to Rabbah, the word litzorich means direct use. Shaloi litzorich, indirect use. And both are mutter when we are speaking about something which is malachti leheter, which is primarily being used for permissible uses, and therefore it is mutter. So that's what the Tana is referring to. Now, we imply from this that when it comes to something which is malachti le'isr, for instance, a hammer which is primarily used for malacha, we need to downgrade, we need to limit and restrict a bit more. V'davar shemalachti le'isr, there we have a distinction. Litzorech gufayin. If he's using it directly, he's taking the hammer and cracking those nuts, yes, that's allowed. But litzorech mekaymelai. But if he's merely moving it to vacate the space, vacate the area, he can't do that. Because according to Rabbah's approach, which is a more stringent approach than the approach of Rabbah, which we're going to see soon, Rabbah makes a distinction, differentiate between direct and indirect use. He says, well, when it comes to a kli, which is malachti leheter, it's inherently something which is mutter, then fine, move it, whether you need the kli itself, whether you need the space, that's okay. But when it's something which is designated for isser, then the only way you can use it is if he temporarily changes that designation. He redirects the purpose of the kli. He's going to use the kli itself for a shimush heter. He's going to crack those nuts with the hammer. But if he's merely moving it to vacate the area, he's not actually using the kli itself. The kli retains its status. It's a status. It's not considered to be standing to be used for this purpose. That's not the kelim atzorach. He doesn't need the kli itself. He's merely moving to vacate the area. Therefore, this is considered to be a kli aser. It still stands to be used for malacha. It's not oimed for this shimush, and therefore it's muktzah. But when it comes to kli shemalachti leheter, then we don't have this restriction. It can be moved either for the sake of using the kli itself, tzarech gufay, or even tzarech mekaymai, because that is also regarded as somewhat a shimush here, and therefore it's mutter because we're speaking about something which is inherently standing to be used for heter. You don't need to really change the designation of the kli. It stands to be used for permissible use, so you can move it whether he needs the kli or he needs the space. So this is the shita of the Tana Kama. Nechemi comes and he says, even something which is designated for heter, we are restricted. If he's moving it to use the kli itself, fine, that's its designated purpose. But if he's merely moving this kli to use its space, it's asur. Because according to Nechemi, we are even more restricted. You can only move a kli litzorech the tashmish hamiyuchad loy. Even a spoon, a fork, you can only move it for the sake of its defined purpose, which means using the kli for its designated purpose. But if he's really moving it to vacate the area, that's not called its designated purpose, and therefore it's us. So according to Rabbah, once again, we make that distinction between tzorech gufa and tzorech mekaymi, indirect and direct usages. And therefore, according to Tana Kama, a kli shemalachti le'isr can only be used at tzarech gufay, but not at tzarech mekayme. A kli shemalachti leheter can be used for both purposes. According to Nechemia, even a kli shemalachti leheter can only be used at tzarech gufay. But a kli shemalachti le'isr, of course, cannot be used for any purpose because it's designated for malacha. You can't take the hammer, which is meant to be used for malacha, and use it to crack a nut. That's certainly not the designated purpose of this keli, and therefore it's off limits. So that's the opinion of Rabbah. Amalei Rabbah. So Rabbah challenged Rabbah. How can you differentiate between tzarech gufa and tzarech mekayme? According to Rabbah, both are equal and the same. Tzarech mekayme, if he's moving it to vacate the area, shaloi tzarech karsle, you regard that as shaloi tzarech. It's not filling a need. He's not using it. It certainly is. It's part of the use of the kli to move it for the sake of vacating the area. Just as using the kli itself is called tzarech, moving the kli, he needs to move it to benefit from the moving of the kli by vacating the area. That's also called a tzarech. So according to Rava, both things are equated. We can't draw a distinction between these two things. Elama Rava, The pshat in the Mishnah is as follows. When the Tanakh begins and says the kli can be moved, l'tzoyrech, he means as follows. L'tzoyrech means davar shemlachta leheter. Something which is designated for heter can be moved for both purposes. Bein l'tzorech gufay, bein l'tzorech mekoymai, whether he needs the kli for itself or he needs the space, it's mutter. Shaloi l'tzorech, when the Tana says he can move it even shaloi l'tzorech, what does he mean? Afilu mechama l'tzeil, even if he's moving it from the chama, the sun, to the shade, that also is mutter, because he's deriving benefit from this movement. That is also mutter. So according to Rava's approach, since it's a klisha malachti leheter, it's inherently designated for heter, it doesn't need to change the status, the designation of this kli. So it can be moved for all these reasons. Whether he needs the kli, needs the space, or he's simply trying to protect his kli. However, when it comes to something which is malachti le'isr, okay, there Rav agrees there are some limitations, because it's designated for prohibited use. So there, the only reason why he can move it is if he actually needs the kli. V'davar shemlachti le'isr, if he needs the kli or the space, it's mutter. Once again, we equate gufi and mekomi. They're both considered to be hana, benefiting from the kli itself. But if he's merely moving it from the chama to the shade, it's aser. Because since it's inherently designated for malacha, unless he actually changes that designation, he's benefiting from the kli directly, he can't move it. He can't just move it from chama itself. He's more restrictive. Even something which is designated for heter, if he's moving it to use the kli or the makam of the kli, yeah, it's allowed, because once again, according to Rava, both are considered to be direct hana from the kli, considered to be fulfilling the designation of the kli. But if he's simply moving it from the chama to the tzel to protect the kli, it's aser, because that's not considered to be tashmish of the kli. He's not using the kli, he's not benefiting from the kli, therefore going to Nechemia, it's aser. So in summary, we have a discussion between Rav and Rava on how to learn the Mishnah. We have a Tanakama, we have a Nechemia. So when it comes to a kli shemalachti leheter, so a kli which is designated for heter purposes, Rava says you can move it l'tzorech gufay, l'tzorech mekoymai. These are considered to be benefits which he's deriving from the kli. Rava adds that he can move it even mechamel itself to preserve the kli. This is an inherently mutter kli, so you can move it even for that purpose. When it comes to kli shemalachti le'isr, Rava says he can only move it l'tzorech gufay. If he's using the kli itself, or if he's merely deriving incidental benefit by moving the kli and vacating that area, tzorech mekoymai, that's not sufficient enough of a use to allow this kli shemalachti le'isr. Rava says l'tzorech gufay, tzorech mekoymai, on the same boat. We don't differentiate between the two things, and both are considered to be an adequate, sufficient use of the kli, which allows even a kli shemalachti le'isr to be used for these purposes on Shabbos. When it comes to the Nechemia, so it depends. A kli shemalachti leheter, according to Rabbi, could be used l'tzorech gufay, because Rabbi, once again, he considers a direct use of tzorech gufay as the primary use of the kli. And according to Nechemia, only the primary use is allowed. Whereas according to Rava, he equates the actual use of the kli with the use of the space of the kli. They're both considered to be just as equal, just as important. And therefore, even according to Nechemia, he may use the kli shemalachti le'isr for both of these purposes. When it comes to the kli shemalachti le'isr, all agree that can't be used on Shabbos in all situations, because it is designated for malacha. You can't use it for a different purpose. Now, as we pointed out, a thing which is not a kli at all, for instance, a rock, or a piece of wood, a broken kli, certainly according to all shittas, is off limits. It's not a kli. It can't be used for any purpose. And likewise, a kli sheyesh b'chesaron kis, these fragile, delicate items where a person sets them aside and only uses it for its defined purpose, for its defined malacha, that's also off limits on Shabbos and cannot be moved under any circumstances. We're going to see actually in the upcoming Gemaras a discussion about these two categories. Continues the Gemara. Yosef Rav Safra. So Rav Safra was sitting, Rav Acha bar Huna, together Rav Acha bar Huna, Rav Huna bar Chinana. So all three were sitting, V'yas v'karma, they were sitting and saying, we have a kash. L'Rabba, Ali with Rav Nechemia, according to Rabba's approach in Rav Nechemia, who says that even a kli shemalachti leheter, for instance, a bowl, a plate, could only be moved l'tzarech gufay, right? According to Rabbah, we differentiate between direct use, which is allowed, and indirect use, which is not allowed. So according to Rabbah, in Reb Nechemia, hani ka'ares, these bowls, after one's finished using them, heichem metaltalinen. How do we move them? Although they are malachti leheter, but once he's finished using them, he simply wants to empty the area, vacate the living room, vacate his table. How can he move them? L'tzarech mekayma. Amol Rav Safra midi dahava grav shalrei. There's a special exemption called grav shalrei. We had this earlier. This utensil that has ray, it has waste inside. So on account of its repulsiveness, offensiveness, the Chacham allowed it to be moved on Shabbos. So these bowls, these plates may be removed from the dining room on account of their offensiveness. So this is a special reason, a special heter, that allows moving these things. Amalei Abaye l'Rabba. So Abaye asked the same kasha. He asked it directly to Rabbah, however. Lamar, meaning master, you. According to you, according to you in Reb Nechemia's shita, hani ka'aris heichem taltalinlu. These ka'aris, how do we move them? Amalei Rav Safra, Chavrin Rav Safra, our friend, he already answered. Tirguma, he already explained midid ahava grav sharei on account of the halacha of grav sharei. So we equate the two things, and just as that can be moved, these can be moved as well. Eisvi Abaye l'Rava. Now Abaye asked a kasha on Rava from two halachas. Rava again says that a klisha malachti l'isser can be moved l'tzarech gufa and l'tzarech mekayme. Right, according to the Tanakama, we equate gufa and mekayme, and it can be moved for both reasons. Says Abaye, what about the following bryce? Meducha. This is the mortar that we discussed yesterday, which is a klisha malachti l'isser. It's meant to be used for malacha. The bryce says in Yesh Bashum, if there is garlic inside, metal noise, you can move it. But otherwise, metal noise, you can't move it, even if he wants to sit on it. So why? Why can you not move the mortar? So Abaye says, well, if we're speaking about if the halacha is that I can only move this mlachte le'isser kli for the sake of the gufay, so perhaps here he has no intention of using l'tzarech gufay, so it's aser. But according to you, that even l'tzarech mekayma it's mutter. So why in this case is it aser? So he said, we're speaking about mecham l'tzel. He doesn't need the space of the kli, he's simply moving it. He'd like to move it into the shade. In that case, it's aser, even according to me. That's not called benefiting from the chayfet itself, and therefore it's aser. Eisvi has another kasha v'shavan. This is back to the machlekes b'sham b'sil. They all agree. Shem kitzabel of basar, if he hacked his meat on this ali, this thick cutting board, which is mlachte l'isser, because one usually crushes the grains on it, does a malacha, so it's considered to be something which is designated for isser. And all agree that if you already finished using it, cutting his meat, she'asal l'tadla, he cannot move it. Why can't he move it? Says Zumar Chanami here as well, we're speaking of macham l'tzeli, he simply is trying to move it into the shade, in which case it's asr, even according to Rava, because it's not tzarech gufay, it's not tzarech mekaymai, and it's asr. Continues the Gemara. V'hadasnan, what about the following Mishnah? Ein soimchen es hakader bebakas. This is going to be a kasha on all shittas. It's going to be a kasha on Rabbah and on Rava. The Mishnah says, Ein soimchen es hakader bebakas. One cannot support a pot with a bekas, with this block of wood, which is intended to be used for fuel on Yom Tov, and therefore you can't use it for these other functions. Says, well, why not? V'ha bekas to be Yom Tov. Davar shemalachta leheteru. This bekas is something which is malachta leheter, designated for permissible use. And he cannot use it. He wants to support a pot with it, which is called tzarech gufay, right, using the thing itself. And it sounds like certainly not the tzarech mekaymai, if he's simply looking to vacate the space. Alma, apparently, davar shemalachta leheter, even something which is malachta leheter, bein l'tzarech gufay, bein l'tzarech mekaymai is aser. So it's aser if he's trying to use this thing, whether he's using the thing itself or its space. So this is a kasha, because all agree, Rabbah and Rava both agree, that at least according to the Tanakama, one can move a klisha mlachta heta for these purposes. Says the Gemara, you know what the reason is? Although we're speaking about Yom Tov, when this thing is mlachta laheta, because you can burn it on Yom Tov, hasam nahainu time over there. You know what the reason is? Given the b'Shabbos, dava shemlachta le'isru, since on Shabbos this piece of wood is considered to be mlachta le'isr, right? Gzeira Yom Tov Atu Shabbos. The Chacham employed a Gzeira, and they prohibited on Yom Tov Atu Shabbos, lest they come to do this on Shabbos as well. So they made a muktzah on Yom Tov. You can only use it for actual fueling purposes, but you can't use it for other purposes to support the pot, etc. Says the Gemara, 1 second, if you'll say Shabbos Guvay Tishtari, even on Shabbos itself, it should be mutter to move this bakas. If you want to use it, why? The hadav shemalachti le'isur, because even something which is malachti le'isur, l'tzoyrech gufay, u'l'tzoyrech mekaymay, shari. One can use it if he wants to. One can move it if he wants to use the thing itself, and also tzorech mekaymay according to Rava, right? So if on Shabbos itself is mutter, so why would you say on Yom Tov is asur on account of Shabbos? Says the Gemara, Hanimili. This is only heichadika teres kli alav. When the thing has a status of a clear utensil, for instance, that hammer, one can use it to crack nuts. When the thing does not have the teres kli on it, doesn't have the gather, it's not status as a kli, such as this piece of wood, this blog, loy, certainly in that case, on Shabbos, it is totally off limits. And therefore, on Yom Tov, the Chachamim applied a gzeira, did not allow its use, on account of Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Migaz Rinon. Is that the case that we make an Isser on Yom Tov on account of Shabbos? V'atanan, haven't we learned in the Mishnah? Ma'ashilin peiros derech aruba b'Yom Tov. One has produce sitting on his roof and he sees a storm approaching, he sees it's about to start raining. So he wants to get his peiros into the house. Says the Mishnah, he can. On Yom Tov, he can be ma'ashilin peiros derech aruba, he can toss the peiros through the aruba, through this hole in the roof, the skylight. So you can do so on Yom Tov, avaloi b'Shabbos, but he can't do that on Shabbos because it's tircha, it's exertion. So even though he's trying to protect his property, that's not allowed. But on Yom Tov, it's allowed. So we see there's that distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. And we don't say on Yom Tov is asur on account of Shabbos. Says, do we not make a gzera? V'atanan, we have a Mishnah which seems to tell us that yes, Shabbos and Yom Tov are meant to be equated. There's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Only concerning matters of food preparation. Apparently, doing a tircha, such in this case, as he's picking up these pears, putting them through the roof, which is an exertion. He cannot do that on Yom Tov, just as he can't do it on Shabbos. So you see that we do make an isser on Yom Tov as on Shabbos. We equate the two things. Says the Gemara, Omar of Yosef, Loikash. It's not difficult. These two Mishnahs, which seem to contradict each other. The Mishnah which allows the Tircha on Yom Tov, not on Shabbos, and the other Mishnah which seems that to tell us that when to equate Yom Tov and Shabbos, they reflect two different opinions. Hor Rabbi Lezer, Hor Rabbi Shua. These two Mishnahs reflect different opinions. One Rabbi Lezer, and one's Rabbi Shua. Let's see. The Sani is one to the Bryce. Oisev es benoi. So this Bryce is discussing doing Tircha on Shabbos, exerting himself on Yom Tov, So if you have the Oisev es benoi, this mother and son animal that fell into a bar, it fell into this pit. And as we know, one cannot slaughter, it can't be sheichet, a mother and any child in the same day. So he'd like to bring up the animals from his bar. What can he do? Both of them are not fit, are not suitable for Yom Tov. It's either one or the other. So what does he do? Reb Lezer Eimer, Malas Rishon Amas Sheichtoi B'Sheichtoi. He brings up the first one, schleps it out of the bar, with the intention of being sheichet, and he sheichts it. That's it. He can't go further. He can't take the second one and bring it up. Vasheni, regarding the second one, Oislei Parnasa B'Mkaimai, he provides it parnasa, sustenance, where it is, in its place, so it doesn't die. But he cannot do tircha, even for the sake of hefsid, to preserve his property, to spare himself from loss. Tircha, for the sake of hefsid on Yom Tov, is aser. So Rebbe Lezer is compatible with that Mishnah, which told us that there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov, only regarding Eichel Nefesh. So that's the Shita of Rebbe Lezer. We don't differentiate. And therefore, Rebbe Lezer holds that on Yom Tov, one will not be able to do a tircha for the sake of preserving his property. He can't go ahead and take those peiros from his roof and transport them into the house, because one cannot do tircha even to save himself from loss on Yom Tov. Yom Tov and Shabbos are regarded as equals in this matter. So that's the Shita of Rebbe Lezer. Rabbi Shoimer, yes, one can do a tircha to preserve his property, to prevent loss on Yom Tov. And Rabbi Shua is the Shita which told us Mashilim Peres Derech Aruba b'Yom Tov. That on Yom Tov specifically, the Chacham allowed tircha for the sake of preserving his property. Rabbi Shua Eimer, Malas Rishon, I'm not l'shaychta. He can bring up the first animal and present himself as if he's going to slaughter it. Ve'ein shaychta. He decides, I don't want to go ahead and be shaykhet it. Umarim, and he pretends, umalas hasheni, and brings up the second one. Now he has two animals, he has a choice. Ratza, zeh shaykhet if he wants, he shechs this one. Ratza, zeh shaykhet if he wants, he shechs the other one. So we see that Yeshua allows tircha on Yom Tov to save his property. So this is the teretz. That one Mishnah, the Mishnah which allows doing tircha on Yom Tov, bringing those pairs there, charuba, is Rebbe Lezer. The Mishnah which says that generally there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov is Rebbe Shua. Just the other way. The Mishnah which says you can go ahead and bring the pairs derech haruba on Yom Tov, meaning tircha is allowed for the sake of preserving one's property, is Rebbe Shua, who allows bringing up the second animal to spare oneself from hefsed on Yom Tov. Whereas the Mishnah which says we want to equate Shabbos and Yom Tov is Rebbe Lezer, who does not allow tircha even for the sake of preserving one's property, as we find here that he doesn't allow him to carry out the second animal from the bird because there's no use for it on Yom Tov. Says the Gemara Mimai, how do you know to compare these contexts? Dilma perhaps, Ad kan like Rebbe Lezer Hasam. It is only over there where Rebbe Lezer says that one cannot do tircha to bring up that second animal because there's an alternative. There's a clear choice here. Ella the efshel parnasa, because he can go ahead and sustain the animal right where he is. It's not necessarily going to bring a hefsed here. But there's no option of parnasa, for instance, the sake of the payrates which are sitting on his roof. He needs to preserve them by bringing them through the aruba into their home. There's no other alternative. Loy, perhaps over there it's different. It would allow exertion for the sake of preventing loss. Inami, alternatively, Adkan like Amar Bishua Hasam. It is only over there by the animals where Bishua allows bringing up both animals because he can do it in a way of harama, pretends. It looks like he needs it for Yom Tov. So since he's at least outwardly demonstrating that he's conforming with the guidelines of Yom Tov, he's doing it for the sake of Yom Tov. It appears that he's doing it for the sake of Yom Tov. Chacham allowed because it's a situation of hefsid, so they allowed it. But if harama, pretense, is not an option, it's not part of the equation. He's going to carry those peris and be matriach himself to bring them to the house. There's no pretense there whatsoever. Loy, perhaps up there, Rav Shua would not allow. So there's really no justification to compare and to attach both of these contexts to each other. Perhaps they're unrelated. The discussion of the Oisiv as B'nai fell to the Bur is unique, has its own factors, which are unrelated, unconnected to our discussion at hand. Says the Gemara, Elamar Papa. This is going back to the Kasha. We had a stira because we have a Mishnah which says on Yom Tov one may carry those pairs through his aruba to save them, to preserve them, but not on Shabbos. So you see that difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos, as opposed to the other Mishnah which says Ein be Yom Tov l'Shabbos elo eichel nefesh b'lvad. There's no differences between Yom Tov and Shabbos, only when it comes to preparing food, which seems to imply that one cannot do a tircha on Yom Tov, which is something which he wouldn't be able to do on Shabbos. So how do we reconcile? How do we resolve? So we tried Reb Lezer and Rishua, it didn't work. Amar Papa like kasha, it's not a kasha. Ha Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. One is Beis Shammai, one is Beis Hillel. This is not as we learned in the Mishnah. Beis Shammai, Omer, Ein moitzin es hakoton ve'salulav ve'sefer Torah l'shus rabbim. On Yom Tov, one may not carry out a katan, a lulav, a sefer Torah. He could only do it for the sake of eichel nefesh. If he needs to carry food, it's for the sake of food. But other items cannot be moved on Yom Tov, cannot be carried out to Shusram on Yom Tov. Beis Hillel Matirim, they allow even these types of objects. This is discussed, the reason is discussed in Mesechus Beitza. In any case, we see that it seems like Beis Shammai equate Shabbos and Yom Tov. They say when it comes to carrying, one cannot carry on Yom Tov all these types of items, just like he can't do it on Shabbos. And Beis Hillel differentiate. They say, well, all on Shabbos he can't carry out, but on Yom Tov he could. So, pertaining to our discussion, perhaps the Mishnah, which says that one can go ahead and carry those peiros into the home, is Beis Hillel's shita, who differentiate between Shabbos and Yom Tov. On Yom Tov he can do it, on Shabbos he can't. The other Mishnah which equates Shabbos and Yom Tov is Beis Shammai, who's saying that Shabbos and Yom Tov are meant to be equated. Says the Gemara, how could you compare the two things? When did you hear Beis Shammai who restricted? That's only when it comes to Haitzah, carrying out, which is Lacha Dehraisa. Tiltul Mishamaslu, when it comes to moving items about, which is merely a tircha, or let's say when we discussed Muktzah, moving items, that's not Dehraisa. How do you know that there as well, they would say it's Asar and Yantav, just like Shabbos, that they would equate Shabbos and Yantav? Says the Gemara, the tiltul gufay, tiltul itself, moving items themselves, that's also lav mishum haitzah. Is it not because of haitzah? As Rashi explains in Gemara Beitza, that the reason why the Chachamim prohibited moving things on Shabbos Muktzah is so that a person doesn't come carry it out. Do machav haitzah. So two things are very much connected. In order to carry out, you need to first move things around. That's the beginning of the process. So two things are interrelated, interconnected. As Rashi says, if a person will be mezalzel b'tiltul, he'll go ahead and just carry haphazardly mezalzel b'yitzah, that will lead to a zilzal, to a disregard for yitzah as well. So two things are very much connected and related. And therefore, indeed, it's very compatible with Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai, who are strict when it comes to yitzah, are going to be strict when it comes to tiltul and Yom Tov as well. And they will say one cannot go carry those payers into the home, do tircha, even for the sake of preserving laws, for the sake of hefset. Whereas Beis Hillel, who are lenient when it comes to carrying out items haitzah, they will also be lenient when it comes to carrying those payers on Yom Tov and allow him to carry them into the homes, to send them through that aruba, to preserve his payers. So we have that resolution on the stira between the two mishnahs. The mishnah which is Machar Yom Tov is Beis Shammai. And likewise, he will not allow using that bakas, that block of wood, to support his pot, to support his doorway. On Yom Tov, just as it's Muktzah on Shabbos, on Yom Tov as well, he can't do it Gzeira. Yom Tov Atu Shabbos. Whereas Beis Hillel, who are more lenient, they will allow using that block of wood on Yom Tov. We find that they're more lenient on Yom Tov. One can transport the pyrrhus through the roof. One can carry out all these items on Yom Tov. They're more lenient when it comes to Yom Tov. They differentiate between Yom Tov and Shabbos, and therefore he can use that block of wood as well. So in summary, Yom Tov and Shabbos, according to Beis Shammai, they're meant to be equal. One can't be soymich b'bakas, support using that block of wood. The Mishnah which says Ein be Yom Tov l'Shabbos, there are no differences except for Eichel Nefesh, food preparation, is Beis Shammai. As we find Beis Shammai say that Haitzah, carrying out on Yom Tov, is Asur, unless it's for food purposes. Whereas Beis Hillel hold that Shabbos and Yom Tov are not necessarily equated with one another. And therefore, we understand the Mishnah which allows taking those peiros derech aruba to preserve them. As we find that Beis Hillel allow carrying all types of objects on Yom Tov, a cotton, a lulav, and a sefer type. Continues the Gemara. Va'af Rav saval al hadarava. Let's go back to our discussion earlier between Rabba and Rava, where Rava equated tzorech gufay, the direct use of the kli, and tzorech mekaymai, when he's moving it simply to vacate the area. Rava held that even a kli shemalachti le'isr can be moved with tzorech gufay and tzorech mekaymai. Says Mar Rav also held like Rava. V'af Rav saval al Rava, to allow something which is malachti le'isr to be moved with tzorech mekaymai. To Amar Rav, because Rav said, this is a shovel, which is meant to be used primarily for malacha. Shaloi Ganev, if he's moving it simply to preserve it, to protect it from thieves, Zeo Tilta Shaloi L'Tzorech. That's called Shaloi L'Tzorech. Not for a need. It's not filling his need. It's not being Meshamashim, and therefore, V'asar. He can't move for that purpose. Now, let's make a diuk. Taima Shaloi Ganev. That's only because he's simply moving it to protect it from being stolen. But if he's moving it in order to use the kli itself, or even l'tzorech mekaymai, that would be mutter. Eini says, is that the case? That Rav holds that tzorech mekaymai is mutter? We have a story of Rav Kahana. Ikla labei Rav. Rav Kahana visited the home of Rav. V'aman Rav said, Aisule shusa lekahana. Bring this net. So a net is a klisha malachti liser. It's used for malacha. And he said, bring the shusa lekahana, right, referring to Rav Kahana, le'sivale, so that he can sit on it. Now, why did he need to add that description, that he can sit on it? Wasn't he coming to say, the davar shamlachte le'isr, that something which is meant to be used for isr can only be moved l'tzarech gufayin. It is only moved for the sake of using the kli, that he could sit on it, l'tzarech mekaymei loy, but not to use the space. So wasn't that what he was trying to teach them? Says the Gemara, no. Hachi Amar, this is what he told him. Shkulu shusam mikama kahana. Take away the net from before kahana of kahana, meaning make space for him. So we see that tzarech mekayma is mutter. Alternatively, he actually told them to bring it. Now, why did he say bring it so he can sit on it? Because we're speaking about that it was in a place of chama, it was in a sunny area. So he wanted to avoid misconception. The onlooker would think that perhaps he's allowing moving this muktzah thing in order to protect it. That's why he's telling him to move it out of the sun. So therefore, he needs to add that. He needs to say, well, go bring the net from the sun. Right? It was coming from the sun. He said, go bring it so that kahana should sit on it. He was trying to stress that the reason why it was mutter was because there was a function being filled there. There was a purpose. He was using the kli to sit on it. He wasn't merely trying to protect the kli by moving it out of the sunlight. But really, technically speaking, that wasn't a requirement. Even if the purpose of moving it was simply to make room for kahana, that also would be mutter. Continues the Gemara of Mari Baruchel. Havale he had based adusa these mattresses b'shimsha, so they were in the sun, and that's certainly a klisha malachte leheter, right? Also, Kamei Rav, as he came before Rava, he wanted to know what he can do to protect his mattresses to get them out of the sun. Now, Rav Mari Baruchel apparently held like Rabbah, that klisha malachte leheter is also restricted. It can only be moved l'tzarech gufay or l'tzarech mekayim, but not to protect the kli. So he came before Rava, who holds that actually he can move it for all purposes, tzarech gufay, tzarech mekayim, even mechama l'tzel. Right? So he came to ask Rava, what should I do? Amar lei, so Rava told him. So he came to ask him. He said, Amar lei, what should I do? Ma'ala tulinu. What is Allah regarding moving them? Can I move them out of the sunlight? Amar lei shari. He says, sure, you can move it, because Rava held that he can move it even to protect the kli. So Rav Mari Baruchel responded, Isli achrina, but I have other ones. Meaning, I don't really need these mattresses, because he held you can only move it if he's actually using it, but not to protect it from sun. So Rava responded, okay, apparently you hold that you have to have a use here. They're suitable for guests. So move them out of the sun, because perhaps some guests will arrive, you'll need it for them. That is also a legitimate need. So he said, I have other ones for guests. I don't need these at all. Amar leis. Now Rava was sort of exasperated. He said, Golis adaitich. You've demonstrated that your opinion is the karabas virlich. That you hold like Rava, that one can only move something if it is for the sake of the kli itself, if he wants to use the kli, or for the sake of the space under the kli, but not merely to preserve the kli. If so, I have no eitzah for you, I have no solution. L'kuli al mashari. For everybody else, it's mutter to move it out of the sun. But according to you, it's aser because you paskin, you hold like Rav. Amar Rab Abba, Amar B'chei Barashi, Amar Rav. Machbedes shemulsa, these brushes made of fibers used to clean off the table. Mutal taltlum b'Shabbos. One can move them on Shabbos. Aval shel tmaraloi. But the broom is made of palm branches. They used to sweep the floor. Now, generally, their floors was of earth, so therefore, sweeping those floors was a malacha. Ashvuya gumas, right, straightening out those pits in the floor. It's a malacha. So therefore, this kli, this broom, is a kli shem lachta l'yisr. Reb Lezer Omer, ashal tmara, even the ones made of tmara. Says, what's going on? What are we speaking about? Does he need the kli? He needs the kli itself. Or he needs to have the space. In this case, Rav would say that he can't move that broom. Why? We just concluded, Rav was like Rava, that even something which is lachta l'isra can be moved l'tzarech gufa or l'tzarech mekayim. Ela mechama l'tzel. Apparently, we're speaking about merely taking it out of the sun into the shade, in which case it's also. Says the Gemara, if so, b'hal leim Rebbe Lezer, av shel tomorrow. If that's the case, why would Rebbe Lezer say that even this palm broom, which is a lachta l'isra, can be moved into the shade? Nobody holds that you can do that. Says certainly we're speaking about moving from the sun into the shade. Indeed, Rebbe Lezer concurs with Rav that one cannot move it. Continues the Gemara. Kol hakelim anton b'Shabbos. So all the kelim which can be moved on Shabbos, what if they crack up, they break apart? The broken pieces can be moved likewise. Just as the kelim can be moved, the broken pieces can be moved. Ubavad, provided that they're still functioning, right? Because we mentioned earlier something which is useless, a broken kli, a piece of wood, a pebble. That's not a kli, right? The Rambam says only a kli can be moved. So these broken pieces need to be performing some sort of function, need to be suitable for something. Ubavad, provided that they can do some sort of partial malacha. They're suitable for something. For instance, shivrei areva, the broken pieces of the areva, this bowl used to knead dough in it. Some say it was made of wood. So this piece of areva lechas ben piachavis, to use it to be mechasa as piachavis, the opening of the barrel. Shivrei schuches, what about broken glass? Let's say a container breaks apart. So those need to be useful for lechas ben es piapach, to cover some sort of container. So you don't need such a large piece like the areva, because the areva was, let's say, if it was made of wood, so it was less valuable. So you need a larger piece to have value. But the schuches apparently was more valuable. So even a smaller piece, which is sufficient to cover up the piapach, is sufficient. So as long as it's serving some sort of function, it still has a status of a kli, and therefore it can be used on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, that's not enough. B'levad, provided only if it can serve a purpose which resembles its original function. For instance, shivrei areva, the pieces of the areva, mikpa, that can be used to pour some of the soup in it, which resembles the dough which is used in the areva. V'shel schuches, a broken piece of glass, shemen, to pour into it some oil which resembles its original function. It was part of a container which was used for liquids. So you need to have some sort of resemblance to its original function. Otherwise, it undergoes such a drastic status change, and it is not allowed to be used on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. When did this kli break? Before Shabbos or on Shabbos? Amar Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Machlokes. This machlokes in the Mishnah, where Tanakama maintains that it's sufficient if this broken piece can serve any function, as opposed to Rabbi Yehuda, who requires that it resembles its original function. That's only shenishbur me'ever Shabbos, when it broke before Shabbos. So it came into Shabbos broken. The Mar Savar, Rabbi Yehuda holds, me'ein melachton, in only if it serves, it resembles its original function. Me'ein melocha acheres loy, but if it serves some sort of other function, that's not sufficient, because it underwent such a drastic change. That's considered to be muktzah. It's considered to be unsuitable, because it used to be a kli. Now it's just a broken kli. That's not regarded. That's not considered to be a kli, and it's muktzah. Umar Savar, Tanakam holds no. As long as it's somewhat functioning, afilu me'im melocha acheres, even if it's serving a different type of function, it's still called a kli. It's still functioning. So that's if it broke on Erev Shabbos. Aval nishbu b'Shabbos. But if it broke on Shabbos, so they broke apart on Shabbos and they came into Shabbos when they were whole. So since at the onset of Shabbos, it was part of a kli, all agree, divrei hakol, all agree, mutaran, these broken pieces are mutar, even if they're only performing some sort of function. Why? Hoyel, since umuchon al gabe avian mutar, since they were prepared as part of their father, meaning they were part of the original kli, they were one and the same, they were connected with the kli. At the onset of Shabbos, that determines the status of this kli. It's considered to be a kli for Shabbos, even if it breaks apart during Shabbos. As long as it's somewhat still useful, that's enough, because it holds on to its full kli status, which it received at the onset of Shabbos. All agree to this. Says the Gemara, Moisiv Rav Zetroy. We have a kasha from the following halacha. Masikim b'kelim. This is on Yom Tov. One may use kelim as fuel, because they're not muktzah. Ve'im masikim b'shivri kelim. But one may not use broken kelim as fuel. Let's analyze. The nishbur emas. When did they break? Ilaim or the nishbur erev Yom Tov. If these wooden kelim broke apart erev Yom Tov, why can't he use them? Eitzim ba'almaninu. They're pieces of wood which are prepared, they're designated to be used for fuel. And why are they muktzah on Yom Tov? On Yom Tov, one is meant to use wood for fuel. Elalav be Yom Tov. Apparently they broke apart on Yom Tov. So since they broke on Yom Tov, then it's a new entity. It entered Yom Tov as a kli, and now it broke apart. It's like a new creation. It's called noilad. It's a new phenomenon. This is considered to be muktzah. It's not considered to be paired and it doesn't stand to be used for Yom Tov, because at the onset of Yom Tov it wasn't broken. So we see clearly that even when something breaks apart on Yom Tov, it's considered to be off limits. Ela lav b'Yom Tov, it broke apart on Yom Tov. Uktani, and it says masikim b'kelim. One can only use the kelim, whole kelim, ve'masikim b'shivri kelim, but one cannot light these broken kelim. So this is not consistent with what we just said, that when a kli walks into Yom Tov whole, even if it breaks apart on Yom Tov, it's mutter. Here we see clearly that, actually we were speaking about Shabbos before, here we see when it comes to Yom Tov, we don't say that. If it breaks apart on Yom Tov, it's muktzah. It's considered to be a new entity, because it's not anymore serving its initial function, its initial purpose. It's a broken kli, although it's very much suitable for firewood, but it was part of a kli, and this piece of wood cannot serve in that capacity, so it's considered to be muktzah. Ella, says the Gemara, we must switch things around. If we learned that statement mentioned earlier from Rabbi Shmuel, it was as follows. This is how we meant to learn it. This is how we learned it. Omar Rabbi Shmuel machlokes. This machlokes in our Mishnah, whether the broken part needs to perform somewhat, and that's sufficient, or it needs to perform in the same capacity as it initially performed. That's only machlokes shenishma b'Shabbos, when those kelim broke apart on Shabbos. The Mar Sava Muchanu, Tanakama holds it's still considered to be prepared for this function because it came into Shabbos as a kli, right? It wasn't muktzah. It was totally suitable. It was useful. It was a kli, right? Now that it broke apart, it still maintains its original kli status because it's still somewhat useful, even though it's performing in a different capacity, right? But it still has a function, still has a use. It's still considered to be a kli. It doesn't lose its status. Umar Sava Noiladu. Rabbi holds it's a new entity. It's born anew. It's Noilat. Because it's not anymore serving its initial capacity. It was serving, Reva was serving to knead dough. Now this broken piece of wood is merely used as a cover for a chavis. It doesn't resemble its initial function. Therefore it's noilat. Aval mer Shabbos, but that's only if it happened on Shabbos. But if it happened from before Shabbos, Divrei HaKol mutar, and all agree that it's mutar, even if it's serving in some capacity. Why? Since it was prepared for malacha before Shabbos. So since it was already standing to be used for those insignificant functions, it's not considered to be muktzah. That's only because it happened before Shabbos. So it came into Shabbos in that status. So it's considered to be a kli. But if this happened on Shabbos, this drastic change occurred on Shabbos, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's considered like a new entity, because at the onset of Shabbos, it was serving in a different capacity. Whereas the Tanakama maintains, as long as it's serving in some capacity, it's not considered to be a new entity. We don't give it a new identity. It still retains its kli status. So in summary, regarding a kli that broke apart, and the broken part still can perform in some capacity, may malacha, although not in its initial capacity, but it still serves something for something. So if it broke apart during the weekday, all agree it's mutar because it entered Shabbos in that capacity, and therefore it's considered to be a kli. Whereas if it broke apart on Shabbos, we have machlekes. According to the Tanakama, it's mutar because it still retains its kli status. According to Rabbi, it's aser. We need to have that it should perform a shimush which resembles its initial function. Otherwise, it's considered to be noilat. It's a new entity. It came into Shabbos doing one thing, and now it's doing something else. Therefore, it's aser. Continues the Gemara. We're going to have a three-way stira. Tani Chada, we have one brayso which says masikim bekelim. On Yom Tov, one may light these kelim, use them as fuel. They masikim b'shivri kelim, but he can't do so with broken kelim. V'tanidach, we have another brayso which says kishem shemasikim bekelim. Just as we can use kelim, kach masikim b'shivri kelim, we can use broken parts as well. V'tanidach, we have then a third brayso which says ei masikim loy bekelim v'loy b'shivri kelim. One cannot use whole kelim or broken kelim. We have a three-way contradiction. Says the more very simple. There are three shittas. Rabbi Yehuda, the first brayso which says you can use kelim but not broken kelim, is Rabbi Yehuda, who says that something which was created anew on Yom Tov is aser. This broken kli is considered to be noilad, therefore it's muktzah. Rabbi Shimon, the brayso which says that he can use broken kelim, is Rabbi Shimon, who holds this type of transition is not considered to be noilad. It's not considered to be a new creation. It's not muktzah. Rabbi Nechemya, the third brayso which says you cannot use broken or whole kelim, is Rabbi Nechemya, who we mentioned earlier, holds that a kli can only be used for its specified, for its designed purpose, its design function. Is a kli meant to be burnt as fuel? No. Therefore, it cannot be used. You can't use a kli, and certainly not the shivri kelim which broke apart on Yom Tov, which are considered to be a new entity, a noilad, and therefore it's us. Omar Rav Nachman, Now we're going to discuss a case of muktzah machmas chesaron kis, something which may not be moved due to its value. It's designated for construction. Hani livni, these bricks, these shtayrim binyana, which are left over from the construction. Shari l'tiltolinu, one can move them. Why? The chazulim is galai, because they're fit to sit on them. They're not anymore serving the construction purposes. Shraginu, but then if you went ahead and you piled them up, you stacked them up, vada ektzinu, certainly you set them aside for the next construction project and the muktzah. Omar of Nachman Amar Shmuel, cheres ktana. What about a small piece of broken pottery? Mutal tatal b'chotzer. If he's in a courtyard, he can move it. Why? Because he can use it. He can use it. There are kalim there which he needs to cover, so they're not muktzah. Aval bekarmelis, but if this piece of cheres is in a karmelis, an unfenced area, for instance, where it's not common to have kalim there that need to be covered, he cannot move this piece of cheres because it has no use. Rav Nachman the Day Omar, Rav Nachman himself says, I feel bekarmelis, even in the karmelis, one can move the cheres because perhaps he needs it to cover up a spit on the floor, because people linger around in the karmelis, sit down, so it's useful even in the karmelis. Aval b'shesarabim, in the shesarabim where people don't sit around, it's serving no purpose, no function, and it's muktzah. So the location influences the status. V'rava Amar, the location has no influence. Afilu b'shesarabim. Even in shesarabim, it's not muktzah. If it's a kli, if you regard it as a utensil in a chatzah because it has function, it has use, it's irrelevant where you are now, karmelis or shesarabim, it's not muktzah. It doesn't lose its status. V'az the Rava Tamei, Rava follows, is consistent with his opinion, as we have in the following story. The Rava is walking in this street in Mechayza. It vasoi mesane tina. So his shoe or his shoes got dirty with tina, with mud. V'asa shami. So a servant came along. Shakal chasbe, took this piece of pottery, this broken piece of pottery, become a chaperle, and he was wiping, he was cleaning up the shoe. Rome be rabbanon kala. So the rabbanon there, they expressed, they loudly voiced their displeasure. How could you do that? It's muktzah. Hamar. So Rabba responded, why are you criticizing him? It's not enough that they haven't learned the halacha. Migmar, nami, megamri, they're going and teaching their mistakes. If I would be in a chatzar in a courtyard, would it not be suitable to be used to cover a kli? Certainly it would. Hachanami here as well, it's suitable for me, meaning since it has a din of a kli in a chatzar, it doesn't matter where we are. Even in shesarabim, it's not muktzah. Here as well, it's suitable for me. I'm using it. It's fine. If you have a lid of a barrel, so the chavis broke apart. Mutal tal b'Shabbos, one can move the lid, even though it's custom made for this chavis, but it's useful to cover something else with. Tanya mihachi, we learned likewise in the Brisa megufa she nichtata nikatata. If you have a lid from a barrel which broke apart, the lid itself was shvareh on the broken pieces of the barrel, mutal tatal b'Shabbos, he can move it on Shabbos. He shouldn't go at lispais, means to smooth out the edges. He cannot do that. That's a malacha. That's makava patish. He's putting the finishing touches on the utensil. That's not allowed. If he's doing it l'chasas b'zakli, lisbach b'kaber amita, he can't straighten it out, nor to cover the kli, nor to lismech b'kaber amita, to support the legs of the bed, or for any other reason. He can't do that. That's a malacha. Now if he takes this broken piece and throws it into the garbage, asr, he can no longer use it. It's muktzah. Says the Gemara, why is it muktzah? Maskal Papa. Papa asked, if that's the case, if one threw his garment into the garbage, you're going to see here as well, it's asr, it's muktzah? Certainly not. Papa. If he threw this piece of pottery into the ashpa from before Shabbos, then it's also because it's a piece of pottery which is arbitrary. He can decide that this thing is useless for him. It doesn't have any value. So he throws it into the garbage before Shabbos. By doing so, he negates its value, its kli status, and it comes into Shabbos valueless, considered to be a non-kli entity. And therefore it's muktzah. As opposed to the glima, which he throws into the garbage, it's inherently valuable. So by throwing it into the ashpa, he does not reduce it, it does not negate its kli value. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. We began with the machlokes between Rabba and Rava regarding muktzah. According to Rabba, we split. We make that distinction between tzorech gufay, the direct use of the kli itself, tzorech mekaymi, merely moving it for its space. Rabba says when it comes to kli shemlach til iser, and likewise according to Rabbi Nechemi, even a kli shemlach til heter, it is only mutal tzorech gufay. According to Rava, Those two things are equated. Gufay mekayme are considered to be equal and the same. Rav even adds that a kli shel nachti leheter can be moved min hachama latzel to preserve it, can take it into the shade. We proceeded with the machlekes b'sham Mesil. Do we equate Yom Tov to Shabbos when it comes to certain things? According to Beis yes. According to Mesil, no. We had a kli that broke up, and the pieces are still useful somewhat. So if it happened during the weekday and it entered Shabbos in that manner, it's mutter. It's considered to be designated for this purpose and use. It's not muktzah. If it happens on Shabbos, according to the Tanakama, it's mutter. According to Rabbi, it's muktzah because it needs to serve in the same capacity, somewhat that resembles its initial function. We learned that one can be masikin. He can use as fuel kalim, but not those broken kalim that broke on Yom Tov. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that's noilat. It's also according to Rabbi Shimon. He can use the broken parts also. According to Nechemia, you can't even use the kalim themselves because it's not its tasha sham yuchla, its designated purpose. We concluded with the story with Rava, who told us that a piece of pottery is not muktzah regardless of its location.